Hello, this is Adam and welcome to my blog channel. In this talk I'll go through some of the real world implications of a universal acceptance of a fully deterministic universe. I'm actually still a willing agnostic in this area, given I acknowledge a strong case for determinism but don't necessarily fully accept that the concept of free will has no place, or that individuals can't live happy and fulfilled lives. See the links to my videos on this theory, both the summary and longer videos, in the description. But before we bite into the juicy meat of the matter, I just need to clarify exactly what I'm talking about when using the words determined and free will. By free will, I mean the ability to choose between two or more options, with that choice not predetermined. One could then have chosen to act differently than they did. I define determinism here as a state of affairs having been completely determined by a previous state of affairs. Given the initial causal position or previous causal position, every effect of these was caused and determined by them. Logically, determinism would appear to have a strong common sense and scientific backing. Even just considering the cause and effect form, the universe and time are subject to the law of cause and effect. Our bodies and brains are composed of particles which conform to this law. Nothing escapes it. If every particle and process is the effect of a previous cause, then it stands to reason that we, even as aware and conscious individuals, are also determined, with our desires, wants and emotions ultimately traceable, at least in theory, back to the same initial or earliest known causal state. I'm actually very sceptical that such a reality would ever truly be accepted by the majority of individuals. However, let's assume here that our determined universe is as universally known and taught as the laws of thermodynamics, or that the speed of light is a constant, so around 186,000 miles per second. Imagine schools teach determinism as a matter of course, and this is just a general fact, known to all. So what are the implications? Here are my personal top 10 in no particular order. So at number 10 we have meaninglessness. One big one could be an adoption of nihilism, or lack of belief in anything, given that if everything is determined, many would take this fact as confirmation that their life and other people's lives have no objective meaning. Since we are merely grey matter computers programmed to feel, desire and then act in certain patterns which are predetermined long before we were even born, presumably then our present beliefs, even though sharply contrasting with other individuals' beliefs, so I don't know, for example, like a left-wing individual politically as opposed to one who identifies as a right-wing person politically, it would be recognised as arbitrary and based on involuntary internal and external processes. This is not to say that some individuals would not continue to hold certain religious or ideological beliefs, but it is to stress that nihilism, or a conscious rejection of all beliefs, would probably be a very popular stance taken by many, which would have implications of its own. The very concept of belief itself may be rubbished, or at least those types of belief that stress active and intentional means to affect society or the world, given the outcome is already set and immutable. It's pointless, isn't it? So at number 9 we have religious fervency. In our scenario, one route of escape for those absolutely determined, no pun intended by the way, to defend free will to the last would perhaps be a retreat into a deep personal faith. Religions may become a last bastion of retreat given its reliance on faith, outside of and in spite of scientific or logical evidence. The God of the Abrahamic faiths, for example, is a God that created the universe and all its laws, including causality, since in these faiths humanity has a special and unique place as made in the image of the deity itself. God, it could be argued, fashioned a universe that does conform to cause and effect, but also allows for human free will. If individuals ignore the many contradictions of the entity itself and the other logical inconsistencies associated with this area, then in our world here I suspect many folk would flock to the major religions, or perhaps create new ones, to defend the idea of free will, explaining these problems, which I'll outline presently, as merely the inability of humans to understand God, and how he can simultaneously create a fully determined universe, but exempt us. God works in mysterious ways and all that. So at number 8, there's religious crises. So that this might seem a bit contradictory, but I assure you it isn't. At the same time that some religions might be born or grow to adapt to the general acceptance of determinism, others may fade away or at least adapt their theologies. Again, focusing on the Abrahamic faiths, free will, or the ability to choose virtue over sin, is a key and implicit part of these religions. In Christianity, one must choose to accept Christ, that he died for humanity's sins, as opposed to rejecting Christ's gift of redemption. In truth, whether or not one accepts Christ has already been determined long before they were born. This in turn has disturbing implications, given that God's gift of potential redemption is merely a cruel deception. Some individuals will be born and already fated to reject Christ and potentially burn in hell forever. This has other implications, given how can such a God be just or good? This of course doesn't necessarily mean the end of these particular faiths, but may require them to undergo a reformation of sorts to adapt to the new and obvious reality of a determined universe. God created a determined universe where we have no free will, but ultimately has a place for all regardless of what the individual did. However, this kind of thinking does beg the question of why we would need to believe at all then. So number 7, why vote? Related to the next entry on my list, this may seem irresponsible of me and all that to suggest, but seriously, why do something as mundane and routine as voting? Assuming you live in the West or a democracy, the logic of determinism doesn't just magically dissipate when you go into a voting booth. In many democratic countries, there are very few viable options to begin with, for Republican or Democrat, Conservative or Labour and that kind of stuff. And it would be true to say, at least in principle, that the political direction and the specific election you're voting in was decided long ago anyway. Again, much like many other areas whose requisite is free will, democracy and exercising your vote is largely meaningless. So number 6, you have the tyranny of the status quo, which brings me to my next point. If political choice is irrelevant, then such a reality may be used as an excuse to justify any status quo, given it was determined anyway. I mean, why change a rotten system, for example, given that system was, like everything else in the universe, predetermined? No particular individual was responsible per se for any given system. This seems counterintuitive, but in a fully determined universe, does it really make sense to condemn even the most oppressive political systems, given that their setup was not chosen any more than what you had for breakfast this morning was really chosen? So number 5 then, we have crime and punishment, which is often confused with moral implications of having no free will, which we'll get to a bit later. There can be no doubt that justice systems would have to reorient given this new reality. Reorient or adapt, yes, but not become non-existent. It may strictly be true that any person charged with a particular crime could plead innocence on the basis of determinism. However, this would not stop that thief being punished in inverted commas, but would merely change our perspective on why. Even if criminals are technically unable to not commit their crimes, given determinism, this would not make their removal from society or their rehabilitation any less necessary, given other individuals in society still need to protect themselves, and are still compelled in their own way to act to ensure their own survival and self-interest. Locking up a serial killer, for example, in a determined universe is no less necessary than in a free will universe. In our imagined world, or universally accepted determinism, even the most depraved individuals would actually be viewed as tragic and thus pitiable figures, so dangerous, but condemned to a fate out of their control. So number 4, we have accomplishment and reward. So in the opposite direction here of crime and punishment, does it really make sense to praise and reward individuals? Much like our desires and emotions, physical traits are hardly chosen, are they? I mean, to us, in the moment, it seems that we choose whether to act on certain desires and emotions. Do we choose the desire or emotion itself? Do we choose to be afraid or angry in a given moment? So I don't think we do. Can you choose to like a certain song, or do you just, like it? Similarly then, if you have some great achiever, like say a scientist with a high IQ, or who was born in a country with a strong educational system, or with supportive parents, or money, or the best start in life, or something like that, did this hero choose any of these things? Can one choose to have a high IQ, or are we just lucky enough to be born with one? Can we choose where, when, and to whom we're born to? Of course not. This logic even applies to specific other traits. You could argue that X deserves praise and reward because of their hard work or persistence, but again, did X strictly choose to work hard or be persistent, or was that a desire that was preset in them? Does reward and accomplishment make any more sense than holding criminals morally responsible for their crimes? So we're getting a bit more abstract now. Let's talk about the death of the individual at number 3. So such a universal acceptance of determinism might actually be the final nail in the coffin, the concept of a self. So philosophers have debated for millennia on the issue of what defines the self, or how to pinpoint identity. The famous ship of Theseus thought experiment throws up serious questions about identity across time and change. Presumably then, if individuals are simply at base particles acting according to cause and effect, with all interactions and every want, emotion and action preset at the macro level, does this reinforce the notion of the self as just as illusionary as free will itself? So moving on to number 2 then, secular justification for social stratification. A bit of a mouthful, but it just basically, in the past, you had the divine right of kings, or the belief that God chose those to rule over us, and that was what held sway for quite a while, with the idea of a God-set hierarchy to boot as well, which was just prevalent and accepted, especially given the other general beliefs that all injustices would be redressed at the final judgment. At least that's what normal folk were told and believed. During the Enlightenment period, the West moved on somewhat towards social contractualism, so denying the old idea, which saw an emphasis on individual participation as well, and consent, that evolved into the democratic systems that we now live under. Even today, though, societies are hierarchical in many ways, politically hierarchical, with some sections of the populace highlighting perceived economic and political privileges of some over others, as we're seeing at the moment. However, it's easy to see how some in powerful positions could easily justify their privileged places by virtue of the arbitrary cause and effect processes that just led them there. Since their high positions in the hierarchy were merely the result of cause and effect rather than any conscious ill intent, they can't really be held responsible, can they, for the poor lot of those lower than them in the pecking order, as responsibility again implies a freedom of choice, which they simply don't have if we all accept a fully determined universe. So much like the old aristocracies, fortunate folk could claim this was merely predestined. You could have a weird neo-divine right kind of theory coming up here. And then finally at number 1 we have the death of ethics itself. Related to the aforementioned, and indisputably one of the most popular concerns about a general acceptance of determinism, is that ethics will essentially become irrelevant, go extinct. Since ethics are moral principles that govern individual behaviour, implied within the definition is the capacity to choose to begin with, which a determined universe is clearly at odds with. So when we speak of moral systems, we ask, why should we do or why shouldn't we do X? Why is murder or rape wrong, for example? Ethics then, much like the concept of free will or the self, is an illusionary concept. In this world anyway. Since should implies can, it makes little sense in a determined universe where A rapes B to hold A morally responsible. Note this is different from the issue of crime and punishment. Since A embodies behaviour that is a threat to others, they can be responsible in that sense, so locked away, but they can't strictly be held morally responsible. Free will then, or the assumption of choice between two or more acts, is a requisite for moral systems, with the latter being exposed as irrelevant and even kind of daft without the former. However, I urge you to watch my longer video on this subject of applying determinism to morality, which I've linked in the description, for another more positive perspective. And that's it, but what do you think? Have I missed anything out? Let me know, and I shall see you very soon in the next one. This is Adam, signing off.